Good morning. First of all, thank you so much to Sasha and Barbara and Ellen and the whole Typographics team. It's really an honor to be invited to speak to this conference, especially since I've never designed a font. And I was thinking how this morning, to be here at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, I realize I have the real hardcore audience here today. And usually the things I lecture about are history and theory, and it's too early in the morning for that. And so I decided that today I would use my time to show you 3 pandemic books, things we designed. Well, first of all, things I designed within Green Dragon Office, which is my, I think it's called fun-sized office. It's myself, and Ching Wang and Amy Fortunato. So I wanted to start with this screen grab, which is, of course, how we experienced our collaboration, mostly through what I'm going to show you today, and for the last 26 months. And that's Ching Wang on the upper left and Amy Fortunato below. They're 2 of my very long-time Green Dragon collaborators. I think between all of us, we have like 75 years of book design. Anyway, we worked, like so many of you, across Zoom and Miro and the cloud to get through these weird times. And even though the design process was disembodied, we were still designing for things that were going to be manufactured, with ink and paper and glue and bindings in Germany and Italy and Singapore and China, making real things that live in the world. So despite the cloud, our consciousness has always been focused on our notion that the design of books, while being made even more difficult by the pandemic and the post-pandemic conditions, is still the vehicle where, for us, graphic design really lives. And ironically, you're ultimately by printing, you're fixing ideas in time. So while everything is in flux, we're aiming for very long time use. Having done this for a while, I possess a lot of extraneous design baggage, and I could spend the next half hour just unpacking some of that. But I will start out with just one piece of it, which is, while I consider myself to be somewhat a connoisseur of style, this is my chart I invented to describe the lifestyles of life changes of style, and I've always deployed it very self-consciously. We somehow end up with Green Dragon books not having an identifiable visual style. It's a conundrum. And while I love and adore the work of several designers who have recognizable visual signatures, and I'm sure you know who they are, over the years I've really avoided developing such a thing. When I was a child, I worked in the Vignelli office, and I think it inoculated me permanently against ever wanting my own house style. The idea of an identifiable set of graphic tropes that you then apply to whatever the project is at hand. I'm way more comfortable comparing Green Dragon to one of those Savile Row tailors, the ones who make bespoke men's suits to measure for each individual. But instead of the elite luxury of handmade clothing, we still work within really strict economics, largely books co-published by nonprofits to be sold by regular publishers in bookstores, and not in that other wonderful, weird ecology of the artist book fairs market. So as a result, you can't really pick a Green Dragon book out of the pile until you really try to read it. And while that's bad marketing for us, it's actually way more interesting for us as designers, and I hope for the audience. We extract the design strategy for any given book out of the particulars of content and editorial structure, often proposing it ourselves. For years, I've asked students to read J. Abbott Miller's essay, The Idea is the Machine, which I think he published 20 years ago in I Magazine, because it basically summarizes my own philosophy, which is that while many graphic designers are obsessed with imposing visual invention onto content, the path toward a more profound communicative power, at least in the book design, lies in extracting the form and the structure and the typography of the book out of the editorial content. And you can't predict where that methodology will take you. if you contend with each project as its own inimitable thing. This first book, With Eyes Opened, Cranbrook Academy of Art since 1932, is an extreme example of this structural approach. Ching Wang and I worked closely with Andrew Blauvelt, the director of the Cranbrook Art Museum, and of course a graphic designer himself, on this rather complicated 600-page book that covers the history of that school, my alma mater, and both Sasha and Mike Essel's alma mater. There were many editorial pieces to this puzzle, and the first one was 200 full-spread pages of biographies of alumni. So before we even started, there were 400 pages that were spoken for in the book, which needed full color. And then the other big element was an illustrated chronology of the school that incorporated sidebar essays, but which had hardly any color. And then there were 2 big substantial essays on the school's history that had no color, and shorter essays as well. And on top of that, in the middle of the pandemic, we really had no budget. Actually, this is a picture of the end papers using a 1974 illustration by Ed Fella of the Cranbrook campus. Because we had no budget, we had to resort to a very old school analog book design art, that of engineering the use of different printing plans for different signatures. We didn't have money for different papers, so we couldn't use that, but we could change ink. The budget challenge actually helped us solve the editorial design problem, that it wasn't going to be interesting to look at 400 pages of artist bios or 100 pages of chronology as separate sections. So what we came up with, and this is the analog dummy because it was so complicated, we had to actually make it with paper to understand it, is that we interwove the signatures of the different types of content and just abruptly shifted them from type to type. But the chronology, which obviously runs in order, is then intercut with the artist bios, which were run in alphabetical order. This is the printing plan that we had to pass on to the printers, showing the different kind of signatures and how they would interweave. So the result is that as you page through the book, it's a sense of time passing as the chronology weaves through, creating an editorial spine. And it has this very specific Cranbrookish palette of copper and teal that are screened down for backgrounds, and then alphabetically arranged 4-color individual stories of alumni and artists in residence that interrupt the chronology. So even the older bios end up resonating as contemporary or outside of time. At crossover points where black and white signatures hit a color signature, we inserted vintage and recent pictures of the Cranbrook campus, which kind of never changes over time anyway, to sort of staple the parts visually. The typographic character of the book, which is set entirely in 20th century, is a pretty direct lift from Cranbrook's own archive of printed matter, where Venus and Futura were the house fonts used for the art school for decades. As I've noted, the teal and copper are an allusion to the buildings out there, but of course the fluorescent is meant to jolt you, sort of Elliott Earl style, out of the past and into the present. So the book really provides a historical record of an institution constantly interrupted by the work of a crazily diverse set of individuals over time. I'm aware that I'm describing this design very instrumentally, but of course it's way more than that. For me, as a Cranbrook alumni, the impure modernism or tweaked historicism, actually these are the old items from the archive that we used as the sort of typographic reference. Anyway, the impure modernism of Ilil Saarinen campus was so formative, it permanently altered my ability to believe in the superiority of a kind of high modernism. And as much as I love many objects that fall into that stylistic bin, it's only one of many. Cranbrook taught me that style is a language marked by its designer, its users, its time, its place, and it has a life cycle. Though the one thing that was timeless, of course, was my terror at being critiqued by my fellow alumni as to whether or not we captured the essence of the Cranbrook in this book or not. And I'm going to end with this picture of the campus where you are walking to the cafeteria and you walk under a sign that says, "Truth leads to beauty as sparks fly upwards." Speaking of life cycles, the second book I want to show you is Motor City Underground, Lenny Sinclair Photographs, 1963-1978. On one hand, this book is simply a photographic monograph on the work of Sinclair, who, based in Detroit, was a participant in and a witness to a rather amazing moment in southeastern Michigan during those years when movements around civil rights, social justice, avant-garde literature, jazz, and rock and roll converged in one insanely creative stew that I had the good luck of witnessing as a kid. Lenny was a hero of mine as I was growing up in Detroit. I used to paste her photographs on the walls in my bedroom. So it was mind-blowing to get to know her 50 years later and to realize to her the documentation was alive. In her mind, you could not separate out the history of her times from her ongoing work. She kind of didn't really want that monograph in a way. She saw it as a bigger history. So Amy Fortunato and I worked with Carrie Lauren, who runs an amazing independent bookstore in Detroit called BookBeat. He's also dedicated to researching and documenting the cultural history of this same era in the city. Carrie contributed a multitude of voices and quotes in this mini histories to accompany Sinclair's pictures. Now, some of the earliest books I was attracted to as a young designer were books where photographs were handled in a cinematic way, and there's a whole part of my own body of work where I've dug into that frustrated film editor side of my work. Here, my biggest influences were Alexei Brodovich, this pictured here, of course, in the ultimate analog design mode of layouts on the floor. I had studied his work doing my graduate thesis, and then I will also, well, there's many other photographic book designers that I'm interested in as well. The Sinclair book has a long and complicated history that would take, again, this whole morning to describe, but I should say that this photo editing process began for me with a hard drive of 15,000 images and a trip to the University of Michigan archive where more of Lenny's work lives. So I spent years trying to determine to tell Sinclair's story as if her pictures were film stills through sequences that were chronologically accurate, dynamic, and frankly emotional. But this book is not pure cinema, although it's pretty pure as a timeline. Carrie Lauren's contribution of running commentaries for which we used red ink insert reality in a way that I think cuts against the considerable danger of boomer nostalgia that seems to lurk in any book about the 1960s. I mean, I know I'm in the background of actually many pictures in this book, so for me it was super personal and a kind of, a super personal exercise in nostalgia, but I had to try to get out of it for this book. The aesthetic of Motor City Underground, if there is one, is less #TBT and more of the immediacy of reportage, and it was weird and unsettling to be putting the finishing touches of this book together while helicopters were buzzing my house overhead, patrolling the George Floyd protests in my neighborhood in the spring of 2020. At the beginning of this project, it was suggested that we shift Sinclair's work away from its original context and make this book more like a conventional photographic monograph, where the images are isolated and recast as art. Just side note, hippies had guns in Detroit. By running a lot of commentary through truly informative captions alongside a kinetic page composition, I think our design for this book is alive with the idea that the stories that Lenny Sinclair told through her amazing documentation are fundamentally unfinished. And she is still shooting to this day, so in her mind, it's not finished either. Green Dragon designs a lot of museum catalogs, and we frequently work with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which is an encyclopedic museum with a very large and diverse curatorial staff. Curators prepare exhibitions and publications for the public, but at the same time, their status as scholars often renders them a bit conservative when it comes to design. A lot of designers who don't work with museums think that it's some kind of creative free-for-all artist book venue, but in fact it's quite colluded by the large group of people working on any one project. Curators tend to want to align their work with the standards and practices in their own areas of expertise, and depending upon the field, those design standards can be pretty rigid. Now, all of this is way less true for anybody designing a museum catalog, say, on almost any type of contemporary artist. But in the realm of books on what used to be called antiquities, photography is generally really forensic, like this is an older book on ancient Chinese art, and you can see how unartful the images are. And you kind of can't escape that forensic photography because it's usually shot that way for conservation information. And the images often reside in the graphic design equivalent of the white cube, a theoretical term for the default of the plain white gallery wall, white pages with polite columns of vaguely classical typography meant to convey seriousness. The last book I want to show you is a catalog that we designed for a show that just opened called The Portable Universe, Thought and Splendor in Indigenous Colombia. Now, I have to say, when I heard the title at first, I knew immediately that splendor meant gold objects. And there've been other shows on Colombia. The whole issue of the kind of ancient metallurgy is kind of glamorized. But the curators warned us that they had a different idea about it. When we met with them, they described a trip that they had made to discuss objects that LACMA possessed with a tribe of the Arhuaco peoples in the Sierra Nevada of northern Colombia. I think they actually, part of their journey was, I think they were expecting to have conversations about repatriating some of the objects they knew came from that area, which is why they were meeting with those people. But they were very surprised by the reaction of one of the local leaders, a gentleman in this picture named Mamo Camillo, who, after gazing a long time upon the photocopied images of some of the objects, declared that the objects were, in fact, alive beings, and they didn't want them back because they were out there doing work. They were not sure that things like the museum's desire to accurately classify or date what came to be called items was of any more importance than the fact, in his view, that the items possessed, in the words of Mamo Camillo, the objects are messengers. The curators, Diana Magaloni and Julia Burtonshaw, really took in this information and challenged us as designers to rethink the way we might present the photographs of the items and the relationship between them and the places they came from. They had taken a lot of pictures as they traveled for research, and obviously their trip, increased their desire to connect the artwork to the land it came from. So included in all of this as well, what was going to go in the book was a catalog of indigenous birds classified by scientific names and their traditional significance, since in those places birds are basically seen as avatars that speak for the natural world. We thought of the landscape photographs as the backdrop for a scrapbook of this intellectual journey. And in the hands of amateurs, like these kind of famous exaggeration postcards, American vernacular, or in the hands of great artists like these scrapbook pages by Hannah Hoch, the power of juxtaposition and collage as a surrealist device has its own power to make the viewer see things with fresh eyes. We argued visually, with success, to avoid sticky issues of scale in favor of maximizing the action and personality of each of these items in relationship to the landscape and plants and birds that were their colleagues, so to speak. So this book is entirely made of that same forensic photography, although albeit just shot against white, which we then silhouetted and actually put into the landscapes to create these kind of strange compositions. The nature of the landscape is emphasized, allowed to bleed across sections of the book. So again, you have this, you can't tell really if these are big or small. The curators, we decided jointly to not worry about the issue of trying to convey that information, which is usually part and parcel of the design of a book like this. There you see one of the bird biographies alongside, the standard captioning for the objects. But, this is pretty unorthodox in terms of the world of books on these kinds of subjects. The sequences are interrupted by the essays, which are typeset in Pica, a font designed by Oscar Guerrero Canizares of Sumo Type in Bogota, which was our little nod to the globalism of contemporary graphic design in this book. And they provide all of the material that marks this book as a container of up-to-the-minute museum scholarship. But in the end, I think we created a book that sits animatedly somewhere between the northern and southern hemispheres with an energy and respect that I think does the items justice. Our local art critic of the LA Times, Christopher Knight, has already criticized this show for representing the point of view of the indigenous peoples a bit too heavily. I, of course, don't agree. But that was precisely what we were trying to capture. So I've shown you 3 totally different books today. The continuity between these 3 titles is purely philosophical and not formal. The philosophy is that we're going to use typography and page composition to enhance the subjects for wider audiences who might not come to this kind of scholarly work, and by that, using a kind of very robust visual energy. While everything about book production and publication, like so much else in our society, gets weirder and more difficult all the time, I think we feel great privilege to be able to work on such projects and, long-lived books. Thank you so much.